had the pleasure of listening to our keynote speaker at several conferences over the past few years, and you guys are in for a real treat, let me tell you. He is an award-winning investigative reporter, a lawyer. He joined the Student Press Law Center. That's an important organization that you need to learn as student media members. He joined in 2008. He's now executive director. He is truly the champion for student rights. He's had articles about the First Amendment widely published, and probably no better expert on this area. Let me introduce to you Frank LoMonte.
Thank you so much. You're not expecting any important calls, I hope.
Well prepared today.
Important texts. So, good morning. Wow, full house. Thanks so much for being here. So Dr. Moretti described this as the formal part of the presentation. It is a presentation, but I promise it will not be formal. I am a student speech guy. That's my life. That's my job. And so what that means is I want to hear some student speech this morning. So there's nothing more dreadful than an hour of a lawyer talking to himself. Believe me, I can do it. I have done it, but it's painful. I want this to be interactive. I want this to be a conversation. So you guys jump in, and I'm going to leave some time for us to talk at the end. I thank you so much to everybody in this department for making this visit such a breeze and such a pleasure for me. A wonderful dinner last night. It truly is warm is the description I would say for this campus and this faculty. It's a very welcoming place. I hope everybody gets a chance to check out the campus and meet this outstanding faculty. But also, don't be in any hurry to get to college, guys. I spend like 2/3 of my life living in hotels, and having somebody else fix your breakfast and vacuum for you is like such a racket. It is such a thing, guys. Do not leave that behind in any hurry. I'm going to call up our website here for a second, which means I have to step away from the mic. But I will try to shout because I'm loud. First of all, I want to know who I'm talking to here. So tell me, this is us. Oh, there we go. Tell me, who here is a college student? Is a college student enrolled here? Okay, so wow. Okay, like a third of you. All right. Who's at a public high school? Public high school. Okay, and anybody from a private high school? Just you. Okay. All right. One busload here. All right. Well, most of what I want to talk about this morning has to do with the First Amendment as it applies to students in public schools. And so for you guys, I am afraid that this may be sort of a like dangling a steak in front of a room full of vegans that, oh, it tastes so good. Oh, this is so delicious, but I'm so sorry you can't have a bite. Because the first principle of the First Amendment, right? I mean, if you don't learn anything else about the First Amendment in civics, is it only applies when the government tries to tell you what to say, right? When the government tries to tell you what to say or stop you from saying something you want to say. We're at a private school, right? Not the government anymore. This comes as a really, really, really awkward surprise to a lot of people when they get out into their jobs and they believe themselves to be covered by the First Amendment. You guys remember like last year with Duck Dynasty, when one of the stars of Duck Dynasty gets suspended from the show by the producers because of some remarks that he made. And people went nuts, right? First Amendment, whatever happened to freedom of speech? And the answer is what? That's a TV network. They're not the government. They get to do that. They have the authority to punish their own employees if they want. And he can go to work someplace else. He can start a petition drive. He can start a social media group. He can complain all he wants to, but what he can't do is take his TV network to court under the First Amendment. That is reserved for the rest of you in the room, the people who are at a public high school. The Student Press Law Center was set up 40 years ago. We're about to have our birthday, actually, in 2 weeks. Our 40th birthday is in 2 weeks. And we were set up specifically because of a book written by a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, Jack Nelson, from the Los Angeles Times. He wrote a book in 1973 called Captive Voices, and the purpose of the book was to kind of shine a spotlight on the censorship problems of journalism in schools, how censorship at that time in the early 70s was stopping students from talking about stuff like what was going on in the 70s. This is like current events for me, ancient history for you. What was going on in the early 70s? Vietnam, right? Drug drugs, rock and roll, all that kind of fun stuff. And what were the students telling people not to write about? Vietnam, drugs, and rock and roll, right? Write about anything you want to as long as it's not those things. Everything that's in the headlines, everything that you most want to talk about is off limits. And that was the bottom line of Jack's book. So as a result of that book, a year later, the decision was made, you guys need a lawyer. You need a legal defense organization to be able to step up and be your voice, be your strong right arm, be your advocate when you feel like there's nobody on your side. Because I remember this very well. I was the editorial page editor at my high school newspaper, and I thought I was pretty hot stuff, and I used to take on my administration and my student government, and I had a couple uncomfortable visits to the principal's office, and I remember thinking that it was really a lonely, lonely thing, and nobody else was on my side. Even other students a lot of times didn't support it, didn't understand it, right? And I get that. I didn't know, actually. I didn't know that there was an SPLC around. I might have burned up the hotline if I had known. But we're here. This is us, SPLC.org. We're just SPLC on Twitter for those of you who are tweeting. And we're here to help. It's a free service. It's there to answer questions about any legal matter that you want to ask about. And I'm going to save questions to take some questions at the end. Well, we said we were going to talk about the law of free speech online and in social media and in cyberspace, and I definitely want to get there. But first, before we get there, we have to lay a little groundwork about the First Amendment in general. Did some of you get, or most of you get, I hope, one of my wristbands when you came in, the Cure Hazelwood wristband? I'm going to explain the backstory behind that in a minute. I think the best way to tell that story is by showing you a couple of court cases that have taken place in your own neighborhood here in Pennsylvania. So case number one, this one. This is a case about wristbands. It's a case about wristbands brought by students in Easton, Pennsylvania, who went all the way to federal court. Brianna Hawk and Kayla Martinez, two middle school students, show up at school wearing wristbands that don't say Cure Hazelwood, they say, I heart boobies. Right? The forbidden B word. The principal is alarmed by this, believing that this will inflame the passions of teenage boys and make them uncontrollable in school. Because I've been a teenage boy, I know that that's how I learned about breasts from a wristband. The principal, being fearful that this was going to make school uncontrollable, decides to ban these wristbands, and the students are sent home and suspended from school for wearing them. Well, a lot of people at that point would have probably thrown in the towel and said, okay, I give up. But Kayla and Brianna decided that they had a First Amendment right to keep wearing these because, right, even though this isn't words coming out of your mouth, even though this isn't words on a newspaper page, it's still speech, right? It's still expression, and that's what the First Amendment exists to protect. It's a message, it's an opinion, it's a viewpoint. That's why we have a First Amendment. Took their school first to U.S. District Court and then to a federal appeals court in Philadelphia. This took a couple of years to get worked out, but in the end, the federal Third Circuit Court of Appeals, which is one step below the U.S. Supreme Court, decided that yes, that's First Amendment constitutionally protected speech, and a school cannot ban it and cannot punish it. So think about that for a second. I mean, the Constitution, the First Amendment, is such an amazing equalizer, right? You know, I know that when you're in school, you're 15, you're 16, you're looking at this authority figure with a tie on, a well-dressed person who has a couple of degrees hanging on the wall, and you feel like there's this gigantic difference in authority between you, and school can be kind of a disempowering place. I get that. But the First Amendment is that great equalizer. The Constitution is what tells government officials, you know what? You've got lines you can't cross. You got boundaries you can't step over. You have to be respectful of the rights, even of people that you disagree with. So that's case number one. How does this work when we get to cyberspace? Here we go. This is case number two. Oh, there we go. I will. I'm just going to do that. This is case number two. Case number two, brought by another middle school student in Pennsylvania, who was disciplined for a a social media page that she created about her middle school principal. Now, before I go any further with this case, I should tell you that there is a huge difference between what the First Amendment protects and what is a good idea, okay? and I do not, as an adult, as an educator, advocate that anybody try this at home, okay? This is not something that should be tried at home. This is not ideal or optimal speech, but there's a difference between ideal and optimal speech and what the Constitution lets the government punish, right? I mean, for you guys, right, anybody here who's got a girlfriend who's ever asked, do these pants make me look fat? Right? You know that you can say yes, but you know that wouldn't be optimal. You know that wouldn't be wise and that wouldn't be smart, and so you don't. So there's a big difference between what you can say and what you know that it's smart to say, and so you say the smart thing. This student in the Blue Mountain School District created a page mocking, making fun of her school principal. They were in a dispute over the dress code. They were in a disagreement over the dress code. She's been punished, thought it was unfair. She decided she was going to kind of settle the score by setting up this profile that made fun of the principal. It was very cruel, mean stuff. It was not the kind of speech that anybody ought to engage in. But it was commenting on the performance of the principal as a government official. This case, too, went to a U.S. District Court. This case, too, went to the Federal Appeals Court in Philadelphia. They came back with a decision saying that there is a difference. I really want you guys to get this. There's a difference between speech online that takes on government officials about topics of public concern on the one hand, and speech that just attacks vulnerable kids on the other hand. And if the speech just attacks vulnerable kids, if it's what we're now calling cyberbullying, right, that's never going to be protected by the First Amendment. But if it's speech that's commenting on the performance of a school, the performance of a government official, well, you know, that's why we have the First Amendment, right? That's kind of why we threw the tea in the harbor, so that you could criticize government officials, right? And so even though this was nobody's idea of an optimal way to comment on government policy, it was protected by the Constitution. And if you go around the country from courthouse to courthouse, you go around and look at what the courts are focusing their time on these days, you're going to find that there's dozens and dozens and dozens of cases like this where judges are kind of struggling to figure out, well, where are these First Amendment boundaries? Where are the lines? Where do we draw the line when we're not talking about a printed newspaper or a bracelet that exists in the physical world, but when we're talking about speech that's on your phone, that could be portable anywhere, right? That could be read anywhere, that might be Googleable years after the fact. Do the old school rules still apply, or do we have to write new ones? And I'm interested in hearing from you guys at the end about that issue, because I know that somebody in here has got a story about being disciplined for social media or knowing somebody who has. This is hard. It's hard stuff. The U.S. Supreme Court has never, ever, ever said the word Facebook in an opinion. I checked. It has never actually come before the U.S. Supreme Court yet, but it will this fall. For the first time in December, they're going to actually have a case that involves social media where they're being asked to decide if somebody goes on Facebook, and this wasn't a kid, this was an adult, somebody goes on Facebook and posts a bunch of speech that looks threatening. People feel frightened, people feel threatened, people feel alarmed. They think the guy might be violent, might commit an act of violence, and he comes back afterward and says, ho, 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 just kidding. Is that enough to prosecute him for a threat or not? And that, too, is hard. That's a really hard question, because we all know that especially after Columbine, after Virginia Tech, after Newtown, that people are very, very sensitive to threats to do mass violence, as they should be, as they understandably should be. Well, the reason that these cases came out the way they did, the reason that students were found to have a protected right to speak, is because a lady named Mary Beth Tinker and her brother John went to court back in the 1960s and established a legal precedent that still stands up today, the Tinker case. Who's familiar with that? Who's heard about it? Who's read it in school? Oh, man, I wanted to see your hand. That's disappointing. All right. Yeah, you guys know this one. You know it. You studied it in middle school and you forgot it, like everything else from middle school. So this is what, right? This is the case involving the kids who go to high school and middle school in Des Moines wearing anti-war armbands. They're told to take them off. This is starting to sound familiar, right? This is starting to sound like something that happened in Easton, right? They're told to take them off. They say, I think this is First Amendment protected speech. I have a right to do this. Take their school all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1969, our Supreme Court tells us, yeah, that's constitutionally protected speech, even on school grounds, even during school time. You can wear that message expressing your viewpoint on an issue of social and political concern. Well, that was wonderful, but it wasn't the end of the story, and that's what brings me to the wristbands. So in 1988, our Supreme Court sort of came back and took back with the left hand what they had given us with the right. They took back in a case called the Hazelwood case, Hazelwood versus Kohlmeyer. So who's heard of that one? You know, I'm not that disappointed by that. If you haven't heard of Hazelwood, that's probably a good thing. If you haven't heard of Hazelwood, that's probably a good thing, and I'm going to tell you why in a second. But the Hazelwood case is the one and only case involving high school journalism ever to get in front of the United States Supreme Court. These students in a high school in the St. Louis area wanted to publish a spread of stories. We can look back at this now in 2014, and it's kind of like, ho, I can't believe this was controversial, but this is like, whoo, hot stuff in the 1980s. They wanted to publish a story about teen pregnancy, one about what it was like when you're in a single-parent family where your dad has left, and the principal thought this was too hot to handle for teenagers. You can get pregnant, you just can't talk about it. You can't write about it. And the principal decided to censor that paper, so the paper comes out with 2 blank pages in the middle. Well, the student editors, right, you can imagine what you'd feel like if this happened to you. They're pretty alarmed by this, and having remembered their middle school lesson about Mary Beth Tinker, they decide they're going to take their school to court, and under the Tinker rule, they're going to win. Well, gets all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and our Supreme Court tells us in 1988 that we've now got 2 kinds of speech in schools, not just one. There's Tinker speech, and that's still the law, still on the books, and it's still protecting things like boobies bracelets even today, right? But it's not the end of the story. If you're using your own body like a billboard, your wrist, your baseball cap, your t-shirt, your hairstyle, whatever, you're using that to make a statement, that's Tinker speech. But when you're using property supplied by the school as part of an academic exercise, now that's Hazelwood speech. And some of you saw the magazine put out by the SPLC out on the front table. If you didn't get one, please grab one on your way out. It's got a cover story about the musical Rent. And the musical Rent has become a lightning rod for schools all across the country. Since Hazelwood, this has become an area of First Amendment controversy. Can students put on plays that have bad language and sexual themes, or can a school censor those as being inconsistent with the educational mission and purpose of the school? Well, under Tinker, the answer would clearly be the school cannot. Under Hazelwood, the rule is probably yes. And under Hazelwood, schools have exercised a fairly heavy hand of authority over plays, newspapers, yearbooks, graduation speeches, anything where you're using a platform that is paid for by the school as part of the school's kind of teaching mission. That's going to be Hazelwood speech. The First Amendment still exists in Hazelwood land, but it's way reduced. Basically, as long as the school can point to some legitimate basis for the decision, they're going to win and the student is going to lose. But that, too, is not the end of the story. And the reason, I hope, that most of you have not heard of the Hazelwood rule is because, for all intents and purposes, that rule is dead in the Pennsylvania public schools. Why? Because you have this. You have the Pennsylvania Administrative Code, the Code of Student Rights and Responsibilities, Section 12.9. And what the Pennsylvania Code of Student Rights and Responsibilities, passed by your state Board of Education and ratified by your state legislature, says is that the basis for a school to censor students' speech is no longer Hazelwood, but you are back to the land of Tinker. That basically in the state of Pennsylvania, if a student publishes something in a newspaper or a yearbook and the school wants to change it or take it out or reword it or censor it or confiscate it, they're going to have have to show that the speech is illegal, right? You're libeling somebody, you're threatening violence against them, or that it's going to prompt a disruption of school activities. You know, you're putting a front page story that says, everybody throw your books down and walk out of third period. You know, here's the instructions on how to make the toilets explode. I wish that was an imaginary example, but it's not. That's a real one. Don't publish that. If you don't cross the line of legality or the line of disruption, then the decision on what to publish in a public school belongs to you, and it cannot be taken away. That, too, is not the end of the story, because, as we know, there are some times when schools cross that line anyway. How many of you read or heard the story about the Neshaminy Redskins over in the Philadelphia suburbs? Is that familiar to anybody? Starting to ring any bells? What happened in Neshaminy High School, Bucks County, Pennsylvania, just north of Philadelphia? It's going on right now. The student editors there decided last school year that they were no longer proud to be Redskins, the mascot of the school that has been that way for decades. And they decided that from now on, Redskins was not going to appear in the pages of their newspaper while they were the editors there. That from now on, the word was going to be R blank, 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 blank. And that resolve held up for the entirety of the school year, much to the displeasure of their principal and school board, who ordered them to continue printing the name of the mascot against their wishes. It resulted in the school enacting a policy that is inconsistent with Section 12.9. We don't know how this is going to come out. The students have legal representation, and I would predict that the courts are going to have to sort this out, but it's a fascinating test of the First Amendment and Pennsylvania state law in action. Can the students make the decision not to publish what they consider to be an offensive racial slur, or does that decision belong to their school? Well, the takeaway, I hope, from the cases that I've told you about, and I just want to talk for another minute or two and then throw this open to a discussion, but the takeaway from some of these cases that I have told you about is that the closer your speech looks to something that is questioning, criticizing, commenting upon a government policy or the performance of a government official, the more protected that speech is going to be, and the more your speech looks like it is just personal, kind of screwing around, or certainly making a threat of violence, even one that is a joke, the less protected it is going to be. And so there are folks who, in student newsrooms, who kind of steer themselves clear of writing about political and social issues. They kind of censor themselves. They're fearful that they're going to get censored, they're going to attract censorship, and so they steer clear of those subjects. And I would encourage you to steer the other way. If you ever take a lesson in sailing a boat, what they tell you when you're sailing a boat is that the most dangerous thing you can do when you're facing a wind is to get yourself sideways against it. That's a really good way to tip the boat over, right? What they teach you is to sail straight on into that sucker, because that's how you stay afloat. And my analogy to you in the newsroom is, when you're taking on an issue of social or political significance and you're tempted to censor yourself, don't. Make the school do it. Sometimes you surprise yourself and you find out that they won't, and in any event, it's an unbelievable learning exercise and experience to go through. I've been at the SPLC now for 6.5 going on 7 years, and so I've actually seen an entire cycle of people that look like you in this room go through high school, go through college, and now a few of them actually start law school, which is kind of astounding to me, having known some of them as kids. But the one that really sticks in my mind, one of the very first situations I dealt with at SPLC was at a high school in Missouri, Wentzville, Missouri, suburb of St. Louis, not that far from Hazelwood, actually. Young girl, Nikki McGee, who was a high school editor. Her school decided that they were going to have a no tattoos in student media rule. You could not publish a photograph of a student or a teacher, anybody with a tattoo, because in the view of the school principal, that was thuggish. That was gang behavior, and it was encouraging people to go out and act thuggishly and also break the law because you couldn't get a tattoo until you're 18, right? And the students felt like this was micromanaging their publication. Like they had a legal right to publish newsworthy photographs. Took this as high as they could take it, took it to their school board, took it to their board of ed, got matching t-shirts made, started a campaign, got the news media involved, got professional TV stations to show up, got some supportive editorials written about them, and they lost. They lost. They were outvoted, they were outgunned at their school board. The policy stood and the principal won. But that too is not the end of the story. Nikki McGee went on from that experience to get accepted to her first choice journalism school, one of the hardest ones to get into in the country, University of Missouri Journalism School. She graduated from there last year, got admitted to one of the hardest graduate programs to get admitted to in America, the Northwestern Medill School, and she's halfway to a master's from the Medill School where she's going to go out into investigative reporting when she's done, and I'm sure is going to be awesome. So, who won and who lost that one, right? When you go into President Obama's office in the White House, there is a huge carpet on the kind of circular carpet that covers the floor, and there's a saying on that carpet that a lot of people attribute to Dr. Martin Luther King, but there's dispute over whether he's really the one that originated this or not. He's certainly the one that it's associated with. And the saying says, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice," right? The arc is long, but it bends toward justice. And what that means, right, is it's kind of like when you're standing on the earth, right, and you look out and to you, it looks flat, right? It looks perfectly square here. I'm looking at a straight line, but we all know it's really curved, right? And if you have the right perspective, you can see that it's curved. And it's the same thing with justice, that sometimes it takes a while to get there, but we know what the destination is, that rights always move from worse to better, that freedom always moves from less to more. We're seeing that in Arab countries all across the country with a lot of pain, and all across the world with a lot of pain and growing pains in the process, right? But freedom and rights only ever in a long, long haul move in one direction. And so you as a person standing up for free speech and the First Amendment may not, like Nikki McGee, wind up being the person that actually realizes the benefit of that fight. You may not be the person that scores the touchdown. You may just be the person that gets the ball out to the 40 or the 50. But you know what? That's a play worth making. It's an effort worth fighting, because sometimes you find out that you are the one that made that difference. Last thing before we throw this open, I always want to tell student journalists that although there are powerful legal protections and people like us that exist to help you, in the end, any fight against censorship has got to belong to you, and you have to take ownership of it. Your teacher, your advisor cannot. First of all, it's going to fail if that person is more passionate about your rights than you are. There's just no way. There's just no way. If that person gets out front of the parade and the parade's not behind them, that's a really lonesome place to be. And so you have to take ownership of that. And you are better protected than your own teachers are. It is the reality of where the Supreme Court has left the law of the First Amendment today, that a government employee like a school teacher has fewer First Amendment protections than a student does. And so you are speaking from a place of relative safety, and your teacher is speaking from a place of relative risk. But the most valuable thing that you can do to censor-proof your journalism, to make your journalism the most resistant to censorship it can be, is to do awesome journalism. The journalism that best resists censorship is the journalism that is substantive, that is fair, that is well-researched, that is factual, that is thorough, and by the way, that is free to the extent possible of spelling and grammatical errors, okay? Why? Because that's a cheap excuse for censorship. If I have to go to court and I've got to hold your story up in front of a jury of people that look like your grandma on a screen that big, and it's full of spelling and grammar mistakes, guess what? I'm going to lose. I'm going to lose. Censorship is going to win every single time if the journalism is bad. And so the best censorship insurance you can buy, the best and the cheapest, is just to do your highest and best quality journalism. That's the journalism that we can stand behind. That's the journalism that will endure. That's the journalism that the First Amendment exists to defend. I'm going to stop there and see if anybody has anything on their mind that they want to talk about.
Don't be bashful. Come on. Who's got the first question? There's over here, Heather, your side of the room. Joe Garris over there.
This is such a great question. The question is like, how did we get to Section 12.9? And the answer is Hazelwood. The answer is Hazelwood, that what happened is after the Supreme Court decides that case in 1988, there was sort of a wave of reaction among people in education and in journalism across the country. There's kind of this ripple effect where lots of people felt like that was too much of a reach. That was too much of a pendulum swing in favor of school authority and against individual rights. And so people started to get together and organize. They went to their legislatures, they went to their school boards, they went to editorial pages, and that campaign succeeded in front of the State Board of Ed. And I will tell you that it is almost always students that initiate and lead these campaigns. Right now, I'm working with students in North Dakota, Connecticut, and North Carolina who are trying to get laws as good as the one you already have in Pennsylvania passed in their states. There are 6 states that have got laws like that protect high school students, a 7th that only protects college students, and then there are 3 like yours that have a rule and not a law, Washington State, Washington, D.C., where I am, and Pennsylvania. And so there's 9 states that protect the rights of high school journalists to make their own editorial decisions. It's not quite a groundswell yet, but we're trying to get there. And we think, right, the best argument in the year 2014 for protecting student press rights is that we should want young people to be in newsrooms. We should be doing everything we can to get them into the newsroom and not pushing them out of the newsroom like Jack Nelson said we were doing in 1973. Why should we want you in newsrooms? 3 reasons. First of all, because it's amazing career preparation. There was a study done a couple years ago by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They did a survey of employers, 450 employers all across the country, and they asked, what do you want in an employee? What are you looking for when you're hiring somebody right out of school? And the list of things that they said was like the syllabus for journalism. It was like, well, I want somebody who can think critically, I want somebody who can communicate ideas, who can work together in teams, who can analyze and explain facts to other people, right? This is what you do. This is what you do in a newsroom. It's the best career preparation. And by the way, being in one of those editor positions is just like running a business, much more so than anything you will ever do during the class periods, the academic class periods. I mean, those are great, don't get me wrong, to learn the Pythagorean theorem, but yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've used that. But the workplace skills that you will get in the newsroom are just irreplaceable. That's number 1. Number 2, what do all of us want young people to do when they go online on social media, right? What we want you to do is know the difference between fact and rumor, check your facts, don't defame people, don't invade their privacy, don't steal their copyright protected stuff. This is also what you learn in the newsroom, right? All of the optimal behaviors about being a good citizen of social media are the things you're learning in a journalism class and in a student newsroom. And the third reason is, I'm going to give you guys, I love your trivia questions, so I'm going to give you one. There was a study by a think tank up in D.C., Brookings Institution, a few years ago about the state of journalism, of journalism in the professional media covering education, covering schools and education issues. I don't have any prizes to give out, but
you've got a prize up there on the table you can give away. We'll give you one there.
All right. Oh, hey, all right. Got another disc.
Give another frisbee.
All right. Yeah. So, as an intellectual property lawyer, I must tell you that frisbee is a trademark of the Hasbro Corporation. These are flying discs. Sorry, bonus law. So, the Brookings Institution does this study about education journalism, and What percentage of the pages in newspapers or the hours on TV or the bites on news websites, what percentage do you think is devoted to education news? What percentage? Just yell out a number, I don't care. 7, 20, 12,
21.
I'm going to give it to Mr. 7 here, but you're still way optimistic. 1.6% of all news in newspapers and in major mainstream media was about education issues, even though education is a $1.1 trillion industry in our country. It is the second biggest thing that state governments spend money on, and yet it has less than 2% of the news coverage. Well, who's picking up that slack? Who is telling us if schools are not doing their jobs? Increasingly, it is the people I am looking at here. If you do not bring us that news, guess what? You know, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, they're probably not anymore because the person that used to cover education now has 6 other jobs too because they've laid off half their reporters. You are filling that gap. You're filling that slack, and we need you to.
Other questions from around the room? Don't be bashful. Up here
One
in
right
the
here.
front. Here you go.
How many times in the court cases that either you've worked with or that you know of have like the teacher or advisor that helps run the journalism or the newspaper, which side have they been on, like the administration or the newspaper itself?
Oh, that's such an interesting question, right? The question, if you didn't hear in the back, is like, if you have a court case or legal dispute involving student rights, where do the advisors usually come down? So sometimes there's a difference between private and public positions too, right? Because an advisor, at the end of the day, is answerable to a superintendent and a principal. And sometimes if the superintendent or the principal says, I am ordering you to pull that cartoon or that photograph out of the paper, the answer has to be, yes, sir. Because at the end of the day, your job is dependent on not being disobedient, right? And so sometimes the public and the private positions of the advisors are different, but the ones that we work with at the SPLC tend to be really very supportive of student rights. Why? Because knowing journalism education the best, they know that the students who are running those publications are not reckless, that you're some of the most trustworthy people in the school. I mean, this is, you know, a lesson for everybody here who's running a student newsroom. When school districts censor, right, it is often because there's somebody in the front office somewhere who's never spent a day in a newsroom in their life who thinks that what you are doing is risky and dangerous, and they are a bunch of hormone-crazed teenagers who are going to go off and do wacky things, right? And if you actually sit down, as I have, in a student editorial board meeting, and you look at the care and the thought and the deliberation that goes into the choices, you see how many times those stories are debated and read and revised over the course of that month's or 2-month cycle of producing that publication. I gotta tell you, by the time the typical high school newspaper comes out, those stories have been way better edited than anything on BuzzFeed, way better edited than anything on Mashable, way better edited than anything on a lot of mainstream media news sites today. And so that's a challenge for you guys to communicate to the people in the suits and ties is, you know what? We kind of got this. We got this. We know what we're doing. We're really not going to go off and do anything wacky. But part of that is, this is a word that you hear a lot in the journalism business these days, is transparency, right? Showing your work. This is what they tell you in math, right? Show your work. Showing that process to the public so that they know, yeah, you know what? We don't just pull these things out of a hat. We think about them, we deliberate them, we discuss them. You guys should see our process, and when you see it, you'll have faith in it.
Got time for 1, maybe 2 more questions, if there are any. If not, we've got some more trivia, good stuff to do. All right. Based on what Mr. LoMonte has said this morning, it's not just off the top of my head.
I'm going to just leave these guys with one more kind of a charge to you, a piece of responsibility to you. I showed you the Pennsylvania Education Code, but one of your jobs as students is to make sure that you're getting the full benefit of those rights and you're doing everything that you can to defend and protect them. And so everybody ought to go back and pull their school district publications policy and take a look at what the policy says for student rights and student speech generally, and also about student media and publications specifically, and put it up against the Pennsylvania Student Code of Rights and Responsibilities and make sure that it measures up. Because if it doesn't, you're getting shortchanged. You're getting shortchanged. And you know, if you went at the Target and you got shortchanged, you'd go back to customer service and you'd complain, right? You'd say, I want my money back. Here's my receipt, right? Well, bring that Pennsylvania Ed Code in. That's your receipt. Bring that in, show it to the authorities and say, I'm being shortchanged here. I want my money back. I want the full benefit of what I bargained for here, and what I bargained for is my legally protected rights. That's your job. That's your responsibility. Nobody else is going to do that for you. And if you do, we will have your back. Guys, thanks for having me. Enjoy this wonderful campus and this wonderful day. Let us know if the SPLC can ever help you.